It was a cold, moonless night when I first encountered the black-eyed children. My friends and I had gathered around a campfire in the woods, sharing ghost stories and trying to spook each other. The darkness seemed to wrap around us, the only light coming from the crackling fire and the occasional flash of a flashlight. We were deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, and the isolation only heightened our sense of unease. As the night wore on, we took turns telling tales, each more terrifying than the last. Finally, it was my turn. I decided to share the legend of the black-eyed children, a story my grandmother had told me when I was a child. According to the legend, these children would appear at night knocking on doors and begging to be let in. They looked like ordinary kids except for their eyes, entirely black, devoid of any white or iris, just endless pools of darkness. I could see the fear in my friend's eyes as I described how the black-eyed children were said to bring misfortune and death to anyone who let them inside. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over us, but deep down, we couldn't help but wonder if the stories were true. As the fire began to die down, we decided it was time to head back to our tents. I was the last to leave, making sure the fire was completely out. Just as I turned to go, I heard a faint rustling in the bushes behind me. My heart raced, and I shone my flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated a pair of small, pale figures standing at the edge of the clearing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figures stepped forward, and I could see they were children, a boy and a girl, both around 10 years old. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their skin as white as marble. But it was their eyes that truly terrified me. They were completely black, just as my grandmother had described. "Please, can you help us?" the boy asked, his voice soft and pleading. "We're lost and we need to use your phone." I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything inside me screamed to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The girl stepped closer, her black eyes fixed on mine. "Please," she repeated, "we won't hurt you." I managed to take a step back, my voice trembling as I spoke. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you." The children stared at me for a moment longer, their expressions unreadable. Then, without a word, they turned and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there shaking, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their black, soulless eyes staring back at me. I kept the flashlight by my side, jumping at every noise outside my tent. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sun rising. I told my friends what had happened, but they just laughed it off, teasing me for letting my own story get to me. We packed up our campsite and headed back to town, the memory of the black-eyed children fading as the day went on. Life returned to normal, and I tried to put the encounter out of my mind. But a few weeks later, strange things started happening. It began with small, inexplicable events. Objects in my house would move on their own. Lights flickered without reason, and I often felt like I was being watched. Then one night, there was a knock at my door. It was around midnight, and the sound echoed through the silent house. My heart pounded as I approached the door, every instinct telling me not to open it. But curiosity got the better of me. I peered through the peephole and saw two children standing on my porch. They were the same ones I had seen in the woods. The boy stepped forward, his black eyes glinting in the dim light. "Please, can you help us?" he asked again. "We need to use your phone." Fear gripped me, and I backed away from the door. "No," I whispered. "Go away." The girl pressed her face against the door, her voice cold and insistent. "Let us in. We won't hurt you." I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew that if I let them in, something terrible would happen. I ran to my bedroom and locked the door, hoping they would go away. But the knocking continued, growing louder and more frantic. "Let us in!" they shouted, their voices now filled with anger. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound. It felt like hours before the knocking finally stopped. When I dared to look out the window, the children were gone, but the sense of unease remained. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. I would wake up to find scratches on my arms and legs. My belongings would be scattered around the house, and I kept hearing whispers in the dark. I was living in a constant state of fear, knowing the black-eyed children were out there waiting for me to let my guard down. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet, reading everything I could find about the black-eyed children. I discovered countless stories from people who had encountered them, each one more terrifying than the last. The pattern was always the same. They appeared at night, begging to be let in, and those who did suffered unimaginable consequences. One night as I was researching, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "They're coming for you." My hands trembled as I opened the message. "Your time is running out. They won't stop until you let them in. You must find a way to stop them, or they will take you." A sense of hopelessness washed over me. I didn't know how to stop them, and I was terrified that my time was indeed running out. That night I barely slept, haunted by nightmares of the black-eyed children breaking into my house and dragging me away. The next evening, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. I knew I couldn't keep running and hiding. I had to find a way to confront them. Gathering all my courage, I grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the door. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, the knocking growing more frantic with each passing second. "Let us in!" they screamed, their voices filled with rage. I took a deep breath and swung the door open. The children stood there, their black eyes burning with an otherworldly fury. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, holding the knife out in front of me. The boy smiled, revealing sharp, pointed teeth. "We want you to join us," he said, his voice dripping with malice. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I realized then that they were not just lost children. They were something far more sinister, something evil. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, running to my bedroom and barricading myself inside. As I sat there, heart pounding, I knew that this was far from over. The black-eyed children were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. I had to find a way to end this nightmare before it consumed me entirely. The suspense was unbearable. The house was silent, but I knew they were out there watching and waiting. I had to come up with a plan, but I didn't know where to start. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. I couldn't let them win. I had to survive. And so, with a mixture of fear and determination, I prepared myself for the battle that lay ahead. The black-eyed children had come for me, but I wasn't going to let them take me without a fight. The night was far from over, and the real horror was just beginning. The room was thick with silence, but my mind was a storm of fear and desperate thoughts. I knew I couldn't stay barricaded forever. The black-eyed children would find a way in if I didn't act. I needed help, someone who knew more about these entities than I did. There was one person who came to mind, an old friend of my grandmother's, Mrs. Harlan, who had been fascinated with the supernatural all her life. Mrs. Harlan lived on the outskirts of town, in a creaky old house that everyone whispered was haunted. I'd visited her a few times as a child, and her knowledge of the occult had always fascinated and scared me. I hoped she would have some answers. With the knife still clutched in my hand, I forced myself to leave the safety of my bedroom. The house was eerily quiet, but I could feel their presence, lurking just beyond my sight. I slipped out the back door, hoping the darkness would hide my escape. The journey to Mrs. Harlan's house was nerve-wracking. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. When I finally reached her doorstep, I pounded on the door, praying she was home. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Mrs. Harlan stood there, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw me. "What's wrong, child?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "They're after me," I gasped. "The black-eyed children." Her expression changed to one of grim understanding. "Come inside," she said, pulling me into the house and locking the door behind us. "Tell me everything." I recounted my encounters with the black-eyed children, my voice trembling as I spoke. Mrs. Harlan listened intently, nodding as if she had heard it all before. "You're not the first to come to me with this," she said when I finished. "The black-eyed children are ancient, malevolent beings. They feed on fear and despair, and they're relentless. But there is a way to stop them." She led me to a room filled with old books and strange artifacts. From a dusty shelf, she pulled out a worn leather-bound book. Flipping through the pages, she stopped at an illustration of the black-eyed children. "There's a ritual," she said, pointing to the text. "It's dangerous, but it might be your only chance. You'll need to confront them directly and banish them back to where they came from." My heart sank at the thought of facing them again, but I knew I had no choice. "What do I need to do?" I asked, trying to keep the fear from my voice. Mrs. Harlan handed me a small vial of salt and a piece of chalk. "You'll need to draw a circle of protection around yourself and sprinkle the salt within it. Recite this incantation," she pointed to the page, "and do not leave the circle, no matter what happens." I memorized the incantation and took the supplies, my hands shaking. "Thank you," I whispered. "Be careful," she warned. "They will try to break your spirit. Stay strong." With renewed determination, I left her house and headed back to my own. The night seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper. When I arrived, I immediately set to work, drawing the circle in the living room and sprinkling the salt. As I finished, I heard the familiar knock at the door. "Let us in," the children's voices called, eerily calm. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the circle and began to recite the incantation. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air grew thick with an oppressive presence. The knocking turned into pounding, and then the door flew open, revealing the children standing there, their black eyes burning with fury. "Let us in!" they screamed, their voices a twisted symphony of rage and desperation. I continued the incantation, my voice growing louder to drown them out. They stepped closer, the very air around them seeming to warp and twist. I could feel my resolve weakening, their darkness pressing in on me. But I couldn't stop now. The final words of the incantation left my lips, and there was a blinding flash of light. The children shrieked, their forms dissolving into shadows that were sucked into the ground, disappearing into the earth. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious. The black-eyed children were gone,